Hello! So a while ago I got a request to do a video on the Dred Scott and explain why the Moors feel that this case justifies their claim as Moors and where they are wrong, please. So I wrote it down and we're going to do it today. And I also want to give thanks to the guy who reminded me to turn on the noise canceling setting on the microphone. Okay, so for simplicity, we're going to get the interpretation of the Dred Scott case from this little PDF I found, which is from Motherland American Magazine, titled "What Black People Need to Know About Status, Nationality, and Being Stateless Persons, and Why Not Knowing is Literally Killing Them." As you can see, this is basically a Moorish, a sovereign citizen Moorish. I'm going to make that distinction because some people complained. Yes, not all Moorish Americans are sovereign citizens. Some of them obey the laws of the states they live in and the federal government. The sovereign citizen Moorish movement is an offshoot of that movement. Not all of them are sovereign citizens. Anyways, this PDF cites a lot of information from Taj Street Bay and other stuff, including RB Bay publications, which we've talked about in the past. Anyways, here we go. The 1857 Dred Scott decision. Here we go. The 1857 Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, this is their interpretation of the Dred Scott decision, is still relevant. The decision is relevant for persons referring to themselves as Black African American, according to Black's Law Dictionary 6th edition. Dred Scott case, the case in which the United States Supreme Court held that the descendants of Africans who were imported into this country and sold as slaves were not included nor intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, whether emancipated or not, and remained without rights or privileges except as those which the government might grant them. Dred Scott v. Sanford, blah blah blah. The most common wording of this decision is that a Negro or person of African descent had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Each time that you declare yourself as Black or African American, this is just one aspect of why this reality that you agree to. This is why the police are able to brutalize and execute Aboriginal American people with impunity. Also note that this decision does not apply to any other racial category. Now, to explain why this interpretation of the Dred Scott case is incorrect, we're going to have to go all the way back to the beginning.
The United States was founded in 1776 by a bunch of rich, greedy, white men who didn't want to pay their taxes.
Now, as you should have learned in high school or middle school, the United States is originally formed from 13 colonies. Of those 13 colonies, roughly speaking, the northern colonies were free states, states which did not have slaves, and the southern states were slave states. There's different reasons for why that is. The North had a more industrial economy. The South had a more agrarian, plantation-style economy. Blah blah blah. It doesn't need to be explained in detail. Basically, that's where this all starts. Now, this state of affairs continues after 76, up until the time of the Dred Scott decision, to the point where, as we can see here, there are 15 slave states in 1858 and 17 free states. Again, North is free, South has slaves. Okay, so where does Dred Scott get into this? Dred Scott is essentially a slave from Alabama. His owner moves him to Illinois at some point because it doesn't matter why. But essentially, he moves his slaves to Illinois, which is a free state. Once Dred Scott gets to Illinois, he sues, trying to get his freedom, get emancipated. And the case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And once it gets to the Supreme Court holds what the Moorish PDF says that, quote, African Americans imported into this country and sold as slaves are not included or intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, whether emancipated or not, and remained without rights or privileges, da 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 da. Now, here's a key word. They were not included or intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution. Now, why is that important? Because the Dred Scott decision is an interpretation of the Constitution as it was written, as it was in 1857. Why does this case no longer apply? In 1868, the Constitution is amended to include the 14th Amendment, mostly to deal with the issue created by the Dred Scott decision. And what the 14th Amendment does is that it expands the definition of citizen from what it originally was to now also include all persons born or naturalized in the United States, making them all citizens, which would also include African Americans and the descendants of slaves. So, despite what Moors and people like Toshri Bey say, the 1857 Dred Scott Supreme Court decision is not relevant anymore. That decision was only applied to in 1857 because that's what the Constitution said at that point. Once you modify the Constitution, because basically what the Supreme Court does is that it interprets the Constitution. The Dred Scott decision is an interpretation of the 1857 Constitution. Once there are the 13th and 14th Amendments, the 13th and 14th Amendments are added to the Constitution changes, and this conclusion, the conclusion of the Dred Scott case, that no longer makes sense because now everybody born in the United States becomes a citizen. But one of the interesting things about the Dred Scott decision, beyond the fact that they're wrong about what it says, is that it's a little bit like a fossil. If you're walking down a mountain and you see a fossil of a fish or sea creature, what that tells you is that at one point that mountain was underwater, or that the ground moved up from the ocean, basically. In the same way, the Moors' obsession with the 14th Amendment is like a fossil, because it tells you where they're getting their information from. The obsession with the 13th and 14th Amendments shows that Toshri Bey and sovereign citizen Moors are getting their information from white sovereign citizens. And the white sovereign citizen movement has an almost inverse interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And to understand that, you need to basically go back to, basically American history. The sovereign citizen movement comes out of hatred of the federal government from Reconstruction. Essentially, whites in the South are upset that the federal government is coming down and telling them what to do. It's forcing integration. It's forcing them to allow black people to vote. It's forcing them to allow black people to enter into schools. It's forcing them to pay income taxes in order to promote social programs. It's guaranteeing civil rights for African Americans. All these things are federal laws and federal programs. And that is where the sovereign citizen movement essentially begins. It's a rejection of federal government and federal authority. Now, part of that rejection of federal authority extends to a rejection and reinterpretation of what the 14th Amendment does. Essentially, within white sovereign citizen theory, what the 14th Amendment does, What the 14th Amendment does, according to them, is that it creates a separate category of citizenship, which was limited to African Americans. In their view, only black people are 14th Amendment citizens. This is simplification. They've changed some of their theories over time, but this is basically where it begins. The rejection of federal authority is framed as essentially a resurgence of basically state rights. And as part of that, instead of identifying themselves as United States citizens, what they instead began to refer to themselves is as citizens of the state of blah blah blah, the state of Mississippi, or the state of Alabama. And as part of that, and this is where the name sovereign citizen comes from, because essentially well, let's look it up. Now, if you look at old legal text, well, let's just read it and you'll see what I'm talking about. You would not only sacrifice none of your sovereignty as a citizen, but would gain sovereignty through an Atlantic Union. Let Americans remember this. When the sovereign citizens of your state approved the federal constitution, they remain not merely sovereigns of their state, but gain citizen sovereignty in another. Now, this is where the term sovereign citizen comes from, because they began at saying that they were sovereign citizens of, say, the state of Mississippi or the state of Alaska, and eventually they cut off this. Instead of saying we are the sovereign citizen, it shifted to I am a sovereign citizen of Alaska, or I'm a sovereign citizen of Mississippi, or what. So despite what people say that the sovereign citizen thing is an oxymoron, or that the government invented the term, that is not correct. That is what they started. That is what these people called themselves originally, and basically the name stuck. Now, the remnants of this are still visible nowadays, even though they've kind of watered down the racism and the sovereign citizen movement. It's kind of hush-hush. It's no longer simply rejecting federal laws. It's also about rejecting state laws. But here is an example. Anna von Reitz, which we've been talking about, one of her things, which we'll talk about here. Again, rejection of being a United States citizen, which goes back to Reconstruction and rejecting federal power and rejecting federal citizenship. But Anna has her own little twist, but it's basically the same thing. Quote, "We have objected to it in behalf of all American state nationals." Again, she is identifying herself as a national of a specific state. In her case, she is an American, a national of Alaska. Again, claiming to be only subject to Alaska law, but not federal law. Even though she may not refer to herself as a sovereign citizen, the idea of rejecting federal laws and only identifying yourself as being subject to, but belonging to your state, is a sovereign citizen thing. And again, it has roots in basically racism and civil war, blah, blah, blah. Now, similarly, another version of sovereign citizenship is the version essentially used by Heather Antucci Giraffe. It's also used by a lot of other people. But you may have heard her, essentially the UCC thing, which a lot of sovereign citizens use, including Moorish Americans, is also based on civil war, racism, rejection of federal law. If you've ever heard them say, everything is commerce, everything is guided by commercial law, blah, 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 that is a sovereign citizen. Now, where it comes from is from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and the Indian tribes. Now, what the sovereigns back then were arguing is that the federal government only has the power to to regulate commerce. It does not have the power to enforce civil rights or force school segregation or force states to allow black people to vote or force states to respect the rights of African Americans and other minorities. Essentially arguing that, again, the only thing that the federal government can regulate is commerce, and so it shifted over time to, well, all laws are commercial, blah blah blah. But even though it has shifted a little bit over time, it still has a racist history. It comes from race. But that is the bizarre situation that this all boils down to. We have essentially African Americans copying theories from white racists and passing it off with their own little twist, which is basically what the Moors and Taj Bey are doing by claiming that the Dred Scott case is still good law and fighting against the 14th Amendment. These are arguments that were invented by white racists, which over time became the sovereign citizen movement, and have now shifted into a whole different thing. But yeah, this is where it all comes from.